Welcome to the Target and Percentage Ownership Report. I'm Jason Gilbo at JGilbo11. With me is Ricky Sanders at R Sanders DFS. Taking a look at some plays at running back, wide receiver, and tight end this week, and talking projections and stuff like that. Overall, I think this week's pretty interesting because we have a small week one sample size. We saw a lot of stuff before. How much do you weigh into that in terms of kind of making your projected ownership and touches?
Yeah, it's a tough thing to do. I'm learning slowly because you kind of get stuck in this bubble where you think everyone else is going to think like you do. But, having done this before, you do see that people who went off last week, people are going to immediately buy into them. So you think that, some of the guys who have monster week ones are going to be owned again in week two with people just assuming that, pretty much everything that happened is going to happen again. So it's very difficult to project ownership. I know how I'm going to do it, so I try and, kind of think like the masses, but it's difficult because I kind of came up with my strategy, and I don't think it's the way everyone else is going to do it.
Yeah, definitely kind of jumping into running backs here. You look at David Johnson first. Obviously, you expect him to be fairly heavily owned. Obviously, a solid matchup for him against Tampa Bay at home. I like him quite a bit. Is he kind of your number one heading in?
Yeah, I think if you're going to spend up at back, which I don't think I'm going to do, and we'll kind of get to that, I think he is. That Patriots defense was pretty swarming last week, and he's just such a good receiver, just a good back overall, that he still managed to have a good week. We talked about Todd Gurley last week. I think it's pretty obvious the world's going to be off him. Ezekiel Elliott didn't necessarily look like he's an RB1, at least a full-blown RB1 at this point. So I think having seen them perform last week, if people are going to spend up for a back, it's going to be this guy just because with the high expectations for all the top guys, he's kind of the one that came through in the biggest way.
Yeah, definitely agree. He was kind of the solid top option there. And you also look at C.J. Anderson, who you may or may not have played if you didn't play the Thursday slate, but obviously had a great game against Carolina and gets a Colts defense that obviously is just really banged up and weren't really coming into the season that we were going to be shying away from them anyway.
Yeah, this one's one that I'm actually buying into. So, if I do decide to spend up on back and the pricing is a little bit more difficult to fit on DraftKings than it is to FantasyDraft, I can see him being in some of my cash lineups and things like that. I think everyone's feels the same way, but I'm not sure. It was a Thursday night game, so it's very possible he goes overlooked. But, of the guys that a week ago, the way I felt about him compared to how I feel now, it kind of looked to me like he's going to be the guy in this offense. And I know it's a one-game sample size, but then you look at this Colts matchup. Both Riddick and Abdullah ran for more than 5 yards against him. They caught some passes. Now, Anderson's kind of a different back. He's kind of a small my friends and I like to call them chicken nugget shaped type guys, the little, the Maurice Jones-Drew who are small and thick as opposed to, Abdullah and Riddick who rely basically on speed. But that being said, he's the workhorse. They looked good. I think he's kind of a guy who slid from an RB2 to an RB1 for me. So I think I feel comfortable with him everywhere. I project him for 20-plus touches. And this is a guy who I'm not sure what to expect with his ownership. I say 10 to 15, but maybe people feel like I do. Maybe they don't.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's kind of one of those ones where, maybe as the week builds on, we might see it kind of creep up and get a little bit more buzz. Given it's only Tuesday, it might just kind of stay put for now. Jeremy Langford, you talk about here next, pretty good value source for week two. Obviously, he was kind of a workhorse in week one. We saw him get a ton of touches. And obviously, the matchup is a plus for him as well this week.
Yeah, there's another guy. This is one of the ones that I feel really confident about in projecting. I think that everyone's going to be on him. I think, this matchup against the Eagles, heading into week one, I was a little unsure because that Chip Kelly system last year had the Eagles on the field so often. So you looked at their numbers and you weren't sure if they were skewed. But both these Browns backs last week ran for at least 5 yards a carry. So that has me confident yet again. Langford gets all the work. He gets the goal line. He catches passes, especially with the team having cut Jacquizz Rodgers. So there's really a high floor here for a guy who's not priced like a workhorse back like some of these other guys. So you're going to be getting him at quite the discount with a similar floor to guys like Anderson. Not quite the same floor as Johnson, but still, we're talking about a guy who's going to touch the ball 20-plus times at a reduced price. So it's kind of the Spencer Ware of this week.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. I think he's going to be a fairly chalky guy, and just for the price and workload. And then diving into Theo Riddick, who's coming off an awesome week, and also you touched on, I mean, it could have been even bigger. I mean, he did sit out an entire quarter, as you mentioned here. This backfield could be pretty special, even with the kind of the split carries.
Yeah, Riddick is a guy who was on my radar a little bit last week. Then I watched him, and now I'm just a full-blown Riddick guy going forward. Abdullah looked pretty good too, but this is a backfield that I thought it was, Amir Abdullah was going to get the carries early on, and Theo Riddick was their third down guy, and that was it. But, having watched this game, that's not at all what it was. I mean, Riddick looked like the more explosive player of the two. He just looked like a weapon, and he's a guy who can play in the slot. He's a guy who really is one who impressed me week one. Let's just go with that. You look at his numbers last year, he caught 80 passes. He was in the top 10 or so of running backs in this format because of all the catches. And now you look at this backfield that's got basically a 1A and a 1B with Riddick priced, even less than a guy like Langford. And this matchup really isn't that scary. I mean, Titans allowed some receptions to the position last year. They were kind of stout against the run, so I think that means there might be a little less Amir Abdullah, and they replace him with the short passing game. So I feel really confident in Theo Riddick this week.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, looking at him on DraftKings and FantasyDraft, I mean, reasonable price. On FanDuel with kind of the half-point PPR, are you shifting more towards the other two sites, or do you still think he's a viable option there?
I still think he's viable everywhere, but he's not like a lock and load, or at least one of the guys in the top 5 of my list at the position like he is on FantasyDraft and DraftKings.
Yeah. Like Garrett Blount, you talk about next year, obviously was kind of the guy against the Cardinals, and that was kind of a situation I didn't really expect to see him a ton of. Obviously coming into week 2 against Miami, this kind of sets up more for a game that's kind of suitable for him to just get a ton of carries and kind of just do his thing.
Right, and that's what kind of worries me about him. I think, he's worth using, but I really never feel confident with a Patriots back in cash games. I think some people are going to, but the guys who rarely get targeted, I mean, I don't think he was targeted once in the first game. If he was, it was one target. He did see those 22 carries, and I think people assume that, the Patriots are going to be up against the Dolphins team that's pretty mediocre. Christian Michael ran hard, 4.4 yards a carry in the first week. But I think every time that you assume Bill Belichick's going to do something with this backfield, he does something else. So does this game seem like it should be a blunt game? Absolutely, which is why I wrote him up. Does that mean it is? We'll see. I'm willing to take the shot, especially on DraftKings in tournaments, but I don't think I can do it in cash games.
No, I'm certainly in agreement. We've seen Bill Belichick kind of hold us down before and really catch us going one way when he goes the other. Looking at wide receivers, I mean, this guy doesn't really need much of a breakdown here. Antonio Brown coming off a monster game against Washington. Didn't really see Josh Norman, which was a little bit surprising, but obviously going to get a matchup here against Cincinnati, and is still kind of one of your top options as always.
Yeah, I was going to say they did a good job. Adam Jones did a good job of slowing down Brandon Marshall last week, but Antonio Brown really isn't human. And unless it's, a top 2 or 3 corner, it shouldn't even really make you think about using him in cash. The question is, who do you prefer between him and Julio Jones, who's also in a favorable matchup? But I think Antonio Brown, just above and beyond the best receiver in football. If you can find the salary, you got to use him.
Yeah, definitely agree. And I mean, kind of you're looking here is Odell Beckham next, obviously. Another one who's going to be a pretty popular play going up against the Saints secondary who lost their top corner. Is he coming in at number 1, or is it still Brown for you?
Well, I think in cash games I wouldn't be happy not having him, because if I know there's one guy that's going to be the chalk, it's going to be him. If there's one guy that I think could even push 40% ownership in cash games, it's him. So, if he's going to go off and have one of those 100-yard, 2-touchdown type games and you don't have him, you're really going to be left behind. You're really going to have a perfect lineup beyond that. So 4 cash games for that reason, I think he's number 1. I think you looked at this team last week. They didn't look like great shakes. Delvin broke his leg. So it's pretty much more of the same from last year, where this was one of the worst passing defenses, if not the worst overall. Odell Beckham, I think, is going to have one of those monster games. I have a tough time not using him, but that being said, if you want to differentiate, I mean, using the other receivers on this team is going to be an unpopular way to go about it, and really just not using Beckham. is probably going to differentiate you. If you could find, one of those guys in a slight tier below him instead of him, that's going to be different than the masses.
Yeah, definitely. And I feel a little bit uneasy just kind of thinking about a lineup without Odell Beckham this week. It just seems to be tough to take. Diving into some kind of value mid-tier guys here, you look at Golden Tate. Obviously, this Lions offense looks great in going up against Tennessee. There's a couple Lions in here that we'll get to another one. What do you like about Tate so much?
Well, I think that a lot of people, I saw it tweeted on Twitter a bunch this early this week that Marvin Jones is their wide receiver one, but I'm not 100% willing to commit to that just yet. I do think, again, like kind of their running back situation, it's a 1A and 1B. And I think that people are going to forget about Tate. And he's kind of the guy that I have pegged as their possession guy, which, of course, translates to FantasyDraft and DraftKings. And then you look last week, Stephon Diggs burned the Titans for 100-plus yards, and they allowed the 10th most fantasy points to receivers last year. So nothing really that scary about this matchup. You don't really think as the Titans' defense as one that you targeted offense against, but I think with this Lions team, just the way they play, they're a threat for a shootout pretty much any game. And if they get into this one, I expect more Golden Tate this week. So I like him a lot. Those possession guys, they got the high floor in PPR.
Yeah, definitely. I think still with Jones, it could be still just kind of a swerve off of him. So, GPPs wise, I think the ownership really isn't going to be there.
I agree with you.
Demaryius Thomas, you look at next. Obviously, we just saw a Lions offense torch the secondary for Indy. Now you get Trevor Siemian here, who I liked, and you said he impressed you as well here. Obviously against a tough Carolina defense, but here we're looking at a secondary that he should really be able to exploit. Yeah,
and you look at last year, Peyton Manning basically rated as the worst quarterback in the NFL, so how much worse can it get? And this guy still had 1,300 yards and 6 touchdowns. So in yearly leagues, I kind of wrote off Demaryius Thomas. I don't think I'm going to really regret that with some of the guys I took over him. But I think for this week alone, having watched Siemian last week, kind of have a decent little game against Carolina, a defense that, most have pegged as one of the better ones in the league. Now facing a team that Stafford just torched. I think Thomas is talented enough that none of these corners really scare me with him. He's my preference, but I do think one of these Denver wide receivers has a big game. I'm going to have some exposure to both, but Demaryius is going to be the one I lean heavier on because I think he's the more talented guy, and I think this is a nice week to target him because Trevor Siemian, people are still not sold on him.
Yeah, definitely. And a good shot, in a great matchup to get him at kind of a lower ownership in comparison to the other guys. Steve Smith, on DraftKings and FanDuel, or on FantasyDraft, you're looking at here pretty low prices for a guy who obviously is peppered with targets whenever he's healthy.
Yeah, and we're not going to get political on this show, but I will say against the Browns that all targets matter. And, last week he kind of faced a bit of a tougher matchup, but now, Joe Hayden hasn't been good in well over a year, and this is probably the worst defense in football. So I think Flacco matches up really nicely against them. He led the team in targets last week, 9. I think Mike Wallace had 6. I think most are going to lean towards Wallace because, he burned the defense for a long touchdown. He certainly has the possibility to do that again. But if Steve Smith has anything left in the tank, he's going really hard for that 1,000 career receptions. He's already said that's why he's playing. So until he gets there, he's not going to be satisfied. And this is one of the most motivated guys on the planet. So I even think you can go to him in cash games. I think there will be enough receptions. 5 for 19 last week. I would guess he finishes with more than 19 yards this week. I think he's a threat to score and get past some of these guys. If Hayden's guarding anyone, it's probably not going to be Smith. It's probably going to be Wallace. So he'll even have their secondary corners, and this just matches up pretty well for him for a guy who I think people have written off because of old age.
Yeah, definitely. I like him as kind of that wide receiver 3, helps you kind of spend up at other positions. And as you mentioned, a really solid matchup, and the targets are going to be there. Jumping into tight ends, looking at Jordan Reed, obviously kind of your clear-cut number 1. Obviously with Gronkowski is week to week, as you mentioned here. I think Reed kind of either way at this point is the guy.
Yeah, I think he's kind of the Antonio Brown of this, where you don't really need to dig too much into him. He's kind of matchup proof. I think he could score against anyone. I think we all expected a huge game last week against a team that was pretty susceptible. This team, not quite as much. But that being said, it's a division game. I think none of the Dallas linebackers really scare me that much. I mean, I could see 100 and a touchdown. And, if you got the money to afford it, like I've said at every other position, do it. But I don't think that'll be the route I go this week, at least in cash games. But I can't go an entire week without some exposure to him because I love him that much, because I think he's that much better than everyone else at the position.
Yeah, definitely. And looking at Gary Barnidge, obviously, I think the RG3 injury has affected how people are going to view Barnidge for this week. He was not used, even though he was out there a ton last week. But coming in here now with Josh McCown under center, is that the reason why he's kind of back in this article?
Yeah, exactly. The two of them obviously had something going last year. The issue with him is he rated as, I think it was the 85th tight end, or at least graded in terms of Pro Football Focus this week, behind only Antonio Gates. So you worry, why was he so goddamn bad? But besides that, I mean, I think having a quarterback back that he meshes with will help him out. So I'm really not that worried. I think that holds true. I mean, we've seen it with Antonio Brown, not that I'm comparing the two, but we've seen it with, a bunch of guys where they lose their guy at quarterback and they struggle to have some chemistry. I think this is his guy. I think he's not going to be as highly owned as you or I think, because people are worried about a bad first week, but I'm definitely willing to use him everywhere.
Yeah, I am too. I think, we got two guys here, Gary Barnidge and Coby Fleener, who we'll talk about next, who obviously burned a lot of people in week one. Certainly both me, I'm sure you as well, and Coby Fleener next here. I like going back to him. I think this is another great matchup where, okay, if he doesn't get it done here, then I am just going to ease off.
Yeah, that's exactly what I wrote. Is if Fleener flops this week, it's officially time to start worrying. I mean, I've never been a big Fleener fan. I think his issues with drops are extensive. I mean, like I mentioned last week, the situation was never going to get better than with Andrew Luck, who he was with in college. So if you expect him to come to the Saints and all of a sudden become, the next Gronkowski, I never thought that was going to happen. But we did think that he could at least, having most of the tight end targets do well. He was a big disappointment last week. Again, he's jumping off the charts in terms of, my model, but he's just a guy that I don't really have that much faith in. He's a guy I'd rather reserve for tournaments. I do think a lot of people will go back to the well with him. I do think he has some serious upside. The question is, when balls come his way, can he hang on? And that's a big if for me.
Yeah, definitely. It was one of the bummers. I mean, I'm looking at this New Orleans team, and obviously there's a ton of potential here in terms of just kind of targets all around. Is it more from like a few years ago when we were dealing with Lance Moore and Meacham and all those guys where there just might be too many for one game?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's always the issue with the Saints. I mean, I've never really gone into a game and been like, this is the guy this week. There maybe have been, 1 to 2 occasions in the last year or so where I felt really confident. But they do have so many weapons. Now they're mixing in Travaris Cadet by the goal line. They targeted him a few times. So, it was Snead, it was Cooks, it was pretty much everywhere. Fleener looked awful, so Breeze doesn't need to go to him. I think they use the run game more against a team that's pretty susceptible to it. They were in the top 7 of fantasy points allowed, so I think this is a Mark Ingram week. So Fleener, not a guy that I think is a sure thing by any means.
Yeah, best reserved for tournaments. Eric Ebron, you talk about next here, last line of the article. Found the end zone last week, getting a plus matchup here. Tennessee, struggled against tight ends, and it looked that way in week 1 because even Kyle Rudolph actually found a decent game.
Yeah, and the thing I like about it is they struggled in the red zone last year, 11 tight end touchdowns. I think that's what Ebron's built for. He scored a touchdown in the red zone last week. So, sans Calvin Johnson, I really think that they're going to look to some of their bigger dudes in the red zone. You look at the squad. They targeted Tate a ton inside the 20 last year, but with both Marvin Jones and Ebron, roles expanding, I don't think Tate's going to get quite those same looks. I think he's going to look for those jump balls to the big boys. I think Eric Ebron's that guy. I've had him marked as a breakout tight end as long as he's healthy, which, he made week 1. He's a guy I have a lot more confidence in. I'd rather spend down on him than spend up in Fleener in cash games.
Yeah, definitely. This one, I was playing around with our tools earlier and kind of seeing what the value was, and Zach Miller was popping up a ton. And then obviously you have him in your article here, and you talk about him more just kind of being to fit in those other guys.
Yeah, I think there's upside, though, too. Miller, Wasn't a guy who popped off or anything like that last week, and Philadelphia kind of shut down Barnidge. But, looking at the numbers, Barnidge kind of played a pretty crappy game according to the grades. He wasn't there with his guy McCown, so maybe there was a bit of, they weren't on the same page kind of thing. But, without Martellus Bennett, eventually Jay Cutler's going to start going to his tight end. He loves having tight ends. I mean, the reason they got rid of Bennett is because they have some confidence in Miller as a receiver. And against this Eagles team, it's certainly not a scary matchup. Again, you said 3,000 on DraftKings, 6,000 on FantasyDraft. So basically he scores and he's already in the running for top fantasy points per dollar. So if you're going to spend up a quarterback, then you may want to spend down at tight end. I think he's kind of a guy that makes sense. I don't think you're going to get a goose egg from Zach Miller. I think he's going to be more involved in this offense. So I kind of like him for that price tag.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, definitely allows you to kind of get in some other guys. So a pretty good target there. And cash game wise, I think if you can make it work, I'm not really all against it.
No, that's why I kind of like, the mid-tier guys in a lot of positions for tournaments, is because we talk about cash games, and I think most people are like either Jordan Reed or Zach Miller. At wide receiver, it's either Antonio Brown or I punt. At quarterback, it's either I spend up for luck or I go for Josh McCown. It's, people don't really go for mid-tiers in cash games, so I think the mid-tier guys stand out. So I think Zach Miller is a guy who's going to be more heavily owned in cash games, but it's because you can fit some of those high-tier guys at other positions along with them, and that's a lot of people's cash strategy, and it makes sense to me.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree with you. So that's going to wrap it up for week 2. Be sure to check out dailyfantasycafe.com for all our great tools and content.